Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 4, and I am joined today, as always, by my colleague Maggie Parke. And today, our second special guest, we have Helen from the Clueless Fangirl on YouTube. Helen, welcome. Glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much for the invite, Corey. You know, I'm not just a Clueless fangirl, I'm also your fangirl. So, but you know that for many years now.
Well, thank you, Helen. It's great to talk. Always great to talk to you. And of course, one of the subjects on which you are definitely not clueless is on the Second Age and on Númenor. We've had some wonderful Númenor conversations before, and I'm looking forward to talking about this. So here's what I want to do. As we're thinking about Númenor and the depiction of Númenor in the Rings of Power show this fall, one of the things that I've been we've been talking about a little bit is we've been talking about issues of what it means to be faithful to a text, like sort of what's at stake there, and we've talked about trying to, kind of dial down some of the emotional pressure on it, and think about, but of course one does want to kind of take the story that they depict and compare it with the story in the books and everything. And I want to kind of back up a little bit, look at the big picture of the Númenor story, and just try to, I don't know, kind of remind ourselves, think through what is essential in the Númenor story, right? And when we're looking at what they do with the Númenor story and trying to see, does this fit with Tolkien's Númenor? Are the things that they're concerned about in their depiction of Númenor in the show, how well or how poorly do those line up with the concerns that Tolkien shows in his depiction of Númenor? So, what makes Númenor awesome, and what is what do we think are kind of the most important key elements of the Númenor story? So that's kind of the first big picture discussion I want to have. So where would you start? Like, what's the first number one thing? If somebody said, convince me that the story of Númenor is awesome, what would you say? Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm jumping in real quick to just say, also as a layperson, I also feel like I need to remind everybody I'm not the Tolkien person. So don't be sad for me if I just sit here quietly and bask in the knowledge of these two amazing people, because I'm just gonna listen to them wax lyrically about all this. But I'm also very curious, coming at the perspective of somebody who doesn't know all the details of this world. What's the stuff that would make me want to watch it? Maybe I only have a vague knowledge of this thing called Lord of the Rings. Obviously, I have a little bit more than that. I'm part of this family. But, what is it that would be that widespread appeal in addition to the more minute detail?
Right. Yeah.
So for me, and this is what, and Corey mentioned it before, one of my favorite topics is, although I love the First Age, nothing goes over, is better than a good First Age battle or tragic story, just naming Turin Turamba or, the Fall of Gondolin. All these stories are so epic. And these are actually, some of the first stories he did write, and his heart really, like Beren and Luthien, that's basically partly his love story with his wife, right?
Yes.
But again, so Númenor is obviously the Second Age, right? It's a very long age, and a lot did happen. And for me, the story of Númenor, I like Greek tragedies. This is what my dad named me after Helen of Troy. So, he loves Greek tragedies. He introduced me to to the Lord of the Rings. And I always say, tell the story like The Hobbit was the first English book. English is not my native. I'm German. I grew up partly in England, but, it's not my native language. But The Hobbit was my first, with 6-year-old, English book. So this is literally, my heart is really into this. But again, Númenor is it's so important for me because, again, Greek tragedy, right? And I love the downfall of a whole civilization, right? And that is so, and the way he describes it, this island was gifted. It was a gift to mankind. And they had everything, right? They had more than normal mortal man had living back in Middle Earth or ever had, right? This was the promised island. A star led them to that island, and yada, yada, yada. So many things. And then they literally effed it up, right?
Right.
And so that makes a really good and great story. And this is not just, a lot of people, you can compare to the Atlantis, right? The Atlantis myth and everything.
Right.
But this is more for me because, a lot of that, there are fates, there are 25 rulers, kings and queens, good ones, bad ones, at the end, mainly bad ones. One tried, we might get to him. But you can see this decline and this, the richer the people got and the more they knew, the more they learned, the more morally declined they got, so the scale completely shifted. And that is so fascinating for me, and I really want to see. I'm a very visual person, and obviously I love the books, right? But I want to see that visually depicted, that whole, Sauron coming to Númenor, and then literally him in 50 years, he became from prisoner to advisor to the king. And I want to see all that, how, where was the point of no return? What did happen? Because we have to ask this question. And it's very similar to our times, right?
Right.
The more we want, the more we know, the more we have, the more you have to ask yourself the question, okay, is this everything we do, is it still, morally
is it
correct?
Okay? Right.
Yeah.
Are we headed towards our own destruction? Yeah. No, I mean, these are the really big questions. One quick thing I want to pick up on that you mentioned, which I think is so important and is actually one of the I don't know, I think one of the tensions or even the ironies in the Númenor story, Atlantis, right? You mentioned Atlantis.
Yeah.
And Tolkien explicitly, like, his phrase, like, the note that he wrote to himself, right? That he was going to, quote, do the Atlantis myth, right? He's going to do the Atlantis myth. So he said, like, he absolutely, I won't say he absolutely identified the two things, but he was explicitly thinking about the Atlantis myth when he was doing Númenor.
He called it Númenor Atlantis in an early version, even.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a sense, what he's doing in writing the Númenor story is telling the untold story of Atlantis, right?
Yes.
But that's the irony, I would say, in a sense, right? In a sense, like the Atlantis myth, it seems to me that an essential element of the Atlantis myth is the fact that we don't know anything about it, right? It's an idea, it's a concept out there.
It's a concept,
We have like one sentence from Plato, right? And from that, like all of this extrapolation of, and imagination, the free range of imagination, and over the years, think of all of the different Atlantis stories that have been told, in many different genres and in many different places. The imaginations of folks as they've pictured this, because I mean, just the mere concept. And so, like, the essential elements of the Atlantis myth, right, are it was an island civilization, so we have that sense of isolation, like it's not organically connected to all of the other civilizations around them, and inaccessible in some way, right, because it's often in an island by themselves. Second, that they were blessed and advanced, right, far beyond anything that the rest of the world had done, so that there's this, like, they're just head and shoulders more awesome as a civilization, more accomplished as a civilization than anybody else. And third, they're gone, right? They fell, the island sank, a catastrophic end came to that civilization. Those are the things I would just off the top of my head point to as the three essential elements of the Atlantis myth, like what the Atlantis myth means. And so that's the framework that Tolkien starts from. But of course, in one sense, I would add almost a sort of a fourth thing, like the fourth element of the myth is that we don't know anything about them, right? Like the very absence of information. And so when you're gonna tell the whole story, as I say, there's a little bit of an irony there, right? In a sense, by telling the Atlantis story, you are at least at risk of removing some of the mythic element of it. It's the very unknown part of it that makes it, in some ways, as powerful as it is.
Yes, but the good thing about that is that we do have survivors, right? We do have survivors, and these survivors tell a story, but they keep it exactly how what you just mentioned. They keep it mystical, because it's not, they escape with 6 or 7 or 9. I always confuse that. Sorry. They came with 6 and escaped with whatever. It's very, very low number of people. They escaped, and they didn't they didn't continue where they left off, and that is the big difference, right? They literally they didn't take all the books with them, the knowledge, nothing. They literally started from scratch, and I do think that is for two reasons, but it is still this mystical, this unknown is still, although we have survivors, and literally just through the next generations, nobody ever talks again about Numenor, because they were so ashamed of what their ancestors did, right? That nobody ever talks about it. It's like it never existed. Nobody mentions it. It's not like a shrine is built.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, the sense of personal guilt. I mean, like the Númenóreans, like Elendil considered himself an exile. Right, like he was exiled, as if he were receiving a punishment. He wasn't. He was one of the good guys, right? He wasn't doing the human sacrifices and everything else that was going on. And yet, those survivors of Númenor definitely feel like exiles, like they've been banished from their country and there's a sense of at least corporate guilt and responsibility for what happened in Númenor.
Yeah, they took responsibility. The only thing I would say I never got with this is, why did they crown themselves kings, right? So why did they continue with it? Because my learning would be, we need to change this whole concept of, but this might be, as Tolkien came from a different generation and, a different background. And the thing is, for him, this royal lines, these bloodlines that continue, some didn't because something, they were not good. So this is always a good sign when your bloodline doesn't continue. You're not one of the goodies. This was very important for him to tell a story, and this stood also for concepts, right? So, but I always was like, okay, but you could just not have taken up the title. This is something, like look at Elrond. He could have maybe taken up the title of High King, right? He was one of, Galadriel, she was the older one. There was no real rule of the Noldor kings, right? But still, he could have. He didn't. He was very humble. He was like, no, I'm more like, I'm just a lord of Rivendell. I don't want to call myself king. But I was always wondering, why did Elendil, Anarion, and all of them later on, why they kept this concept of Númenor that was created in Númenor, because before there was no kingship, right? There were just tribal leaders, like in Germanic. I'm German, so I love all my ancestry and my story. So there were like tribal leaders. This was very similar to what they had back in Middle Earth before they were the three houses of men, the Edain, right? What they were given. So I was like, you could have gone back to that. That would be very humble and we're back to Middle Earth. But no, let's found our kingdoms.
Yeah. Well, and of course, on the one hand, it's easy to say, okay, so, and by doing so, they set their kingdoms on the path to recapitulate the same Númenor story over again, which of course does happen. Not as spectacularly in Gondor, right? But they're definitely on the kind of Númenorian trajectory. In Gondor with the, at the height of their power, but, the same exact things that we're hearing about the fear of death and, men spending more time focusing on their, genealogies than on their offspring, and, the kind of sterility of the empire at its height and pride. Now, they never fully cross the lines, right? They don't become this, like, slave-taking, empire-building, human sacrifice, Morgoth worshipping. Like they don't cross those lines that Númenor crossed. But we can see them headed in a similar kind of direction before they collapse because the king goes away, right?
Especially in Gondor later.
Especially in Gondor,
would say.
Yeah. Exactly.
And this is one of the reasons the kings failed. The line of kings failed in Gondor, and they had the Stuarts coming.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it is interesting when we think of it in those terms. So, okay. So on the one hand, I could argue the other side though, and say, all right, well, they become leaders in the New World, right? In Middle Earth when they get there. Not necessarily through a failure of humility. But okay, so like they have a couple different options to them, right? If they go the more sort of humble route, like the isolationist route, like instead of establishing new kingdoms in Middle-earth, we're going to establish like monasteries or something, you know, like we're going to isolate ourselves onto mountaintops and, reconsider the life choices and cultural choices that led Númenor to where it is. And that's it. And we're going to set up like, you know, orphanages and children's hospitals and things like that. And that's what we're going to focus on, you know, and we're not going to rule anybody. That would certainly be more humble, right? That would have been more humble for them to do that. But of course, the one thing that I think is really the thing which makes to me
couldn't fight Sauron in that way.
Right, you can't fight Sauron in that way because there's Sauron, right? And there's Sauron not only Sauron wasn't just conquering the peoples of Middle-earth. He was corrupting the peoples of Middle-earth, right? Yeah. Like the Oathbreakers are the classic example, right, of the local tribe who had come under his influence and come to worship Sauron, right, in the Dark Years. And that, like, this leads them into serious, you know, personal and cultural difficulties, right? So if they're just going to set up in monasteries and children's hospitals, then there's nobody to oppose Sauron. So instead, they take the leadership role. Right, alongside
they had a sense of they had a sense of responsibility for the people of Middle-earth, and they knew they were stronger and more powerful still, you know, even though they didn't bring the technology, because Númenor's technology was literally, you know, like the industrialization, and then they went back to the Middle Ages, or even, you know, I don't know where they went back to, but definitely not that time. So you're right, they had a sense of, okay, but we still must keep evil at bay here, and we are these powerful people, we have longer lifespans, we are good warriors, we know how to fight, we've been fighting in the Second Age with the elves. You're right.
And I think, so actually thinking of adaptations, and it's funny, like the first adaptation thing I'm thinking about Númenor is something that it will certainly not be in this Amazon series anyway. And that is, I would be really interested to think about what would those initial Númenorian kingdoms have looked like the initial startups in Arnor and Gondor. Right?
Yeah.
Because, of course, like from the perspective of the end of the Third Age, that is when you're looking back at the High King Elendil and King Anarion and everybody, you know, through the lens, right, of thousands of years of Gondorian history, they look back at the height of Gondor's power, right? You're looking up at the Argonath, right? And you're looking at all these other things, right? And you're kind of, that's the picture of Isildur and Anarion that you have, like the Argonath, right? These titanic statues, right?
Well, the movies cheated us out of Anarion, sadly.
Yeah,
I hope they mention him in the movie. I hope they mention him in the show. Please don't write him off.
Please don't write Anarion out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would exactly. I
want to see the stone falling on his head, and this is literally his death.
Would it have been so much to ask to see somebody get their head crushed by it would only take a few seconds, right?
Yeah.
You know, and then Elendil and his one remaining son. Then go to, that's all we needed. But anyway, right. Okay, so the point is, though, what were their kingships actually like, right? From the perspective of the late Third Age, it's tempting to look back at like, oh, this was the pinnacle. This was the most glorious moment, right? But I'm not sure. Like, I could easily imagine Elendil and maybe Anarion also, you know, or like Mineldur, right? I'm talking about the initial beginnings. Like once the last alliance part is over, right?
Yeah.
When you look at what was started by Elendil up in Arnor, and then it's going to be carried on by Valandil, right? So like from Valandil and Anarion and Mineldur, right? The first like ruling kings in those kingdoms. What was the kingship like? Mightn't Elendil himself have started a tradition of, you know, like I would be really tempted to bring some of that humility that you were talking about into the kingships and the way that the kingdom is structured and everything to sort of show. The temptation is to look back from the end of the Third Age and see this unbroken decline, right?
Yeah.
From up at the high days of Elendil and Isildur and Inarian, all the way down to the time of the stewards, where things are, you can only just hear echoes and memories of the grand old days. But I don't think it necessarily need to have looked like that, right? I think that the pride, even arrogance of the Gondorian kings especially, right? I think even the Arnorian king, well, the Arnorians had their own issues with the Civil War and stuff, but
splitting up,
but that, of course, itself is a sign of arrogance creeping in. I mean, that's, it's kind of hard to have Civil War without anybody being arrogant. And
I always felt he brought in a concept of that is very well known to us Europeans. He always brought in the concept of the division of a kingdom due to there were no laws. And this was very important always for Tolkien to point this out. They were very often the kings didn't make laws, or the state didn't make laws who's inheriting, and this was very often a problem. And look what happened to Charlemagne, right? This is why the Franks then split up, and then there were 2 sons, and then there were 2 kingdoms, and then later on they had 3 sons, and then that was a big problem. This was why later on many said, okay, now the firstborn son or child, whatever it was, right? They set up rules. And he shows us in a bit, this is how I always felt, especially with Anor, he showed us, but early days in Númenor as well, when Silmarien was cheated out of her, Corey, you and I talked about this when we talked about the Númenorian queens, when Silmarien was cheated out of her in inheritance, actually, she should have been the rightful queen, right? Not her younger brother. And you see that, what's the good line? What's the faithful line? It's her line, right? So Tolkien sneakily, introduces these real life concepts we had in our own history, which I find fascinating. Division of kingdoms due to, we didn't make any rules and laws.
Right. Yeah. And I like the idea of Elendil coming in and essentially being a kind of a lawgiver, right? And establishing a new thing, but then having that, as the power of the kingdom grows over time, the traditions, the older Númenorian traditions, which would have been established by probably a sort of a humbled Elendil, still feeling like, and his sons feeling like exiles and not wanting to make sure that the Númenor problem does not, in fact, repeat itself again, right? Like basically the kingdom is going to have to forget that to some extent. So again, rather than having the kingdom of Gondor under Elendil and Isildur and Inarian be the greatest, most imperial, highest, grandest of all of the have it be quite humble. And then it grows over time. And as it grows over time, it starts to lose its kind of moral and cultural roots, and by the end of the Third Age, what they associate with Númenorian power is not Númenorian power; it's post-Númenorian power, right? Yeah. From later on. Anyway, that's kind of that's if I were doing a like early Third Age adaptation, that's totally how I would do it, and I'll be interested to see how they relate Elendil and Isildur, especially, and hopefully Inarian, as you say, to the whole kind of Númenorian story and how they sort of make that work. But
because they are they are the people that have seen both. They have a longer lifespan, and they literally they've been friends with they've been friends once and allies and even advisors at the king's court in Númenor still, and then tragedy happened, and then they built this new more humble these new kingdoms. So they are the binding people who saw both, and they are the generation that still saw this, because the later generation they just knew it from stories, and nobody was telling these stories anymore, and nobody was writing down the stories. That's also the tragedy of this.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's get back to let's come back to tragedy. I'm indulging in Third Age speculations, and we're totally off topic now.
You want your spin-off, Corey?
Yeah, exactly. Totally want to do a spin-off. But
it's what we do.
That's what we do. Yeah, absolutely.
I know.
The tragedy of Numenor, right? And the thing that I think is essential, and you were talking about this when you were talking about tragedy before, it's not the kind of tragedy where everything's going great and then something horrible happens to them and they lose what they had, right?
No.
This is the kind of tragedy where they make bad choices and their bad choices lead to the collapse of their society. I mean, it's clearly their own fault, but it's
Is
a good
it
tragedy.
though?
Well, see, that's the thing.
Though? I think it's the
yeah.
Valar's fault. I don't think it's their fault.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have never been put on that bloody island to see the blessed, to see the undying lands, to see all the blissfulness, to get introduced to all the concepts and the elves coming, shipping in, and they are like, okay, but yeah, we're going to die. Just imagine the discussion of Andreth and
yes, Finrod, yeah.
Finrod, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I agree. And actually,
it's not their fault.
Yeah. Tomorrow night. So we've been discussing the nature of Middle Earth in my Mythgard Academy broadcast on Wednesday nights, and we're
I follow it.
Just gonna be getting to the chapter that talks about Númenorian aging in part 3, where he talks explicitly about like the Valar. What exactly did the Valar do to the Edain when they went to Númenor, and how did that work? And it's fascinating how he describes his little, I guess, spoiler for tomorrow, or no, tonight. It is Wednesday. This evening, I'm going to be talking about that. But a little spoiler for later this evening, he basically says they make them more like elves. Like they take the humans and they deliberately, like they take their bodies and they alter their bodies to make their bodies more like the bodies of elves, essentially. So we're gonna put the Númenorians into this. You've got the two different paradigms, right? That Iluvatar has established, right? Humans and elves, with the two different fates and the two different ways in which they operate. And the Valar are basically going to be like, okay, let's compromise, right? Let's take these, just as Númenor as a land, right, is like halfway between Valinor and Middle Earth, but more towards Middle Earth. So the Númenorians are going to be sort of halfway between the mortal and the immortal. But the thing is, you can't do that. Like that's not actually possible, right? They remain mortal. You can't be, you can't be kind of immortal. You can't be a little bit immortal. Like you are or you're not. And at the end of the day, a prolonged life, okay. But and Tolkien says it really interestingly that the Númenorians asked for, like basically the Valar said, okay, what do you want? We'd like to reward you. What do you want? And they said, peace and long life, right? And the Valar were like, well, peace is easy. We can do that. Long life, that's tougher. We'll do what we can, right? And I agree with you. I personally would say it was a mistake. Like they should have said yes to the first, no, we can't do the second one. At least not in any way that's going to make a difference long term.
And they didn't understand. So for me, always, when the music was, when the music came into the world and, and everything was created. And the thing is, I don't think the Valar ever understood the concept of men. And you see that many, many times when they want to help and they F up all the time, except Ulmo. He's different.
The only with it Valar,
Exactly. So they love the elves. They invite the elves to live with them because they are so similar, right? In the important things. But men are not, and they never understood men. And that is and then don't interfere with these people. It can't lead to anything. Obviously they will take it, that is human. If somebody would give me one of those 9 rings, I would have taken it. What the F? Yes, give me that ring. Power, magic, immortal life, give it to me. But the thing is, and that is human, and Tolkien wrote the humans as humans. Yes, very the Númenorians were very clever and all that, right? Great warriors, whatnot, and the promised race, but of humans and not elves. And the Valar never understood that concept. from the get-go they didn't. And they didn't live with humans. Ulmo did, in a way, because the water was always there. It was surrounding them. It was surrounding them. He was in touch. He understood them more. The Valar, they closed themselves off, right, in the Undying Lands. And they never, how do you even understand somebody you don't know?
Actually, we're going to talk about Valar shutting themselves off in the Manway's Ban chapter, which we're also hopefully going to cover tonight. But anyway,
my God, we're spoiling everything.
There we go. Yeah, this is a perfect setup for tonight's discussion. But no, exactly. Now, I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the Valar's fault. I mean, the Valar did them no favors. Like, that's clear. The Valar did them no favors, right? And it was clearly, in the end, no long-term benefit to the Númenóreans. And certainly it does, in some sense, set them up for the problems that they're going to go on to have. But of course, it's not like the Númenóreans are not culpable, right? That they're not at all to blame for the choices that they made.
No.
But I agree that in a sense, I think that although they would have been faced with these same problems anyway, like if they had been given this land of peace and they had and been given all the blessings that they were given, as far as like the wonderfulness of the we're told that there are not only was the land very abundant in the sense of bringing forth good things to eat and everything, but also there were lots and lots of metals there, so it gave them a lot of materials to work with and everything. Anyway, given all those circumstances. And a normal lifespan, like not mess with the lifespan issue, right? But they're just like normal people living in this land. I think they still would have faced the same problems, the same questions, right? But I think they would have been set up for it differently. That the sense of entitlement that the Númenóreans have, right? But we're not just normal humans. Like maybe the peasants in Middle Earth need to, but like, why should we submit to mortality? Because we are and they could look around and be like, what separates us from you? We're just like our friends, the Eldar over there. And, it's just, persecution.
And the Eldar even fed to that, right? Because they gave them, they brought them the birds, they brought them knowledge, wisdom, they taught them things. They even fed into that. And you see that especially later on in Gondor with the whole bloodline thing, to not sully, is that a word?
Sully. That's right.
Sully. The bloodline, or thin out the bloodline with marrying regular humans from the north, right? That, but nothing happened, spoiler, although he did marry that northern princess, but that is very, very reminiscent of the exact same things you just said, but that kept on even later on in the Númenóreans, or later on, Gondorians. So I mean, look, I always found, especially the thing, and I don't know who said it, was it Ar-Gimilzor, or so Terpalanti's father, or was it Ar-Pharazôn himself? One of them said, I don't understand, why can't we sail to the Undying Lands? Because my ancestor did. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, Eärendil did, and he pleaded. Yes, he sailed there for another cause, right? And many before tried, and, but still, he sailed, he got an audience, and they aided him in the end. So there are examples of people going there, and even later on, you see, the fellowship being, yes, there are different reasons. I understand all that, but he wasn't wrong, and again, they are humans. They have, and Tolkien knows this, he was a human himself, and he obviously also had wishes and knows how it is to, it's like a child. You tell him, oh, don't sail there. What do? Obviously you sail there, or you want to sail there. So that was also like very, like, maybe they did explain why you shouldn't sail there, but I don't feel they did. They always thought, oh, they just know, or they just accepted. They should have explained more, and then maybe,
and I think,
I blame the Valar a lot, if you know.
I mean, I hear you. I mean, I think that the Valar made like a classic parenting mistake, essentially, in extending the lives of the Númenóreans, right? If you say, once they treated longevity, longer life in the world as a reward, right? When they allowed that to go into the category of reward, something you can earn for good behavior, right? Something you can deserve. Then now the Númenóreans have, so now what you've taught them is that, well, if you're good enough, you can. So therefore, those who have, never-ending life over in the Undying Lands, they've been rewarded most, right? And more than you, right? Just as you've been more blessed than the people in Middle-earth, they are way more blessed than you. Right. So now you've created this envy. The envy already existed, but you fed into that envy, right? You've basically said this paradigm, which is understandable that you have, that the elves have longer life than we do, so they've been more blessed by Ilúvatar than we are. We're the the red-haired stepchildren of the children of Ilúvatar, and nobody, basically, instead of just attacking that whole concept and saying, no, that's not how it works at all. You don't have shorter lives because Ilúvatar loves you less. You don't have the length of your life is not a measure of what you deserve at all. Let's detach the concept of deserving from immortality. Instead, they fed into that. And they're like, you guys have been great, so we're going to prolong your lives, right? Yeah. And then you've opened the whole can. And so when later on they're saying that, so again, the answer to the Eärendil point, right? My forefather went there and it was fine. So, not because he was good. It wasn't a reward to him. It was because he was the son of an elf, right? And so therefore he was given the choice as to which fate he wanted to have, because he had both. He inherited both from his
Although
parents.
Eärendil identified as human, and if it wouldn't have been for his wife, he would have chosen the human.
He would have chosen human.
Say,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, so
no,
again,
I know what you.
But it's not a question of deserving, right?
No.
It's just a question of are you an elf or are you not an elf, right? And you Númenóreans, plainly not elves, right? That's the way it is. Right. And so this is not for you. So, but I agree. The whole building of the halfway land, the whole establishment of the longer but not, never ending life thing does seem to me to set them up for all manner of problems. The Valar make a whole bunch of mistakes. But I agree. That's a big one. One of the two biggest, the first biggest being bringing the elves over to Valinor in the first place. But
And I personally always felt, look, the dwarves, they never, I don't think they, but again, the dwarves are not Ilúvatar's children. That is obviously, and there are a lot of passages that explain how they
are the stepchildren, whether red hair or not.
But but originally they were marionettes,
Right.
But anyway, the thing is, they don't strive for these things. They strive for gold and other things. They don't strive for that concept. And I always felt like what did they do? They always closed themselves off, right? They never intermingled with elves. So, and I always felt, there are the firstborn, the secondborn, and the stepchildren. If those three would have kept apart, I don't think mankind would ever, have been tempted to do all that, and Númenor would never have effed up and all that, right? I do think you are this concept, this is what God wants you to be, you are this concept, you're completely different. But then, elves and men completely throughout the ages became this. Then the elves went to Númenor. Not saying it was the elves' fault, right? They were happy, to see, to aid and to teach somebody. That's what they loved, right?
Yes.
But the human, they literally like a sponge. They took what they got. But the dwarves, they kept their language secret. They kept into their, and this is, I do think, why they were never, in this whole process of temptation of these kind of things.
Yeah,
right?
You're right. That's not their temptation. You don't offer eternal life to a dwarf if you're trying to get him to take a ring of power, right?
Yeah.
You offer something else.
Yeah. And I do think, if the three concepts should have, been kept apart, I think that it would be a complete different story. Obviously not as good of a story, but
Right.
the intermingling of elves and humans,
Right.
that was the
Yeah,
downfall.
no, I mean, I agree. I think it's interesting. And it's all of this is kind of woven through with tragedy, right? Because at the same time, you can also see, like, it's good for the elves and humans to be together and learning from each other. And like, they
Tolkien
were
says
like
that many
designed in
times.
some way to
Yeah.
be kind of complementary to each other.
Yeah.
But under the circumstances, yeah, it doesn't often end well when those come together. Think about the kind of reflections on this that we hear in the Turin Turambar story, right? When they're like, think of like Gwyndor and Finduilas, right?
Yeah.
When Finduilas loves Turin, and Gwyndor is like, okay, first of all, he's not personally thrilled with that situation.
Yeah.
But he doesn't just say, look, girlfriend, Turin's a bad investment, right? He doesn't just, I mean, he is, and he gives her that too. But he's also like, elves, humans, it's not a good idea. This is not no good is going to come of this. And, we focus on Beren and Luthien, we focus on Tuor and Idril, like good things came there, but even they're at a cost in some ways. So, but I mean, in the end, of course, like this is one way of saying all of Tolkien's stories are ultimately tragic, and we can see the sort of the tragedy woven through, the evidence of Arda marred and how nothing works out the way it's supposed to work out. But I agree that this drama that we've been talking about, this problem that the Valar essentially set the Númenóreans up for through what I view as essentially bad parenting, is that this is the fundamental drama of Númenor, right? That when you pour all these blessings upon humans, like them pushing the boundaries, right? Them wanting more than they can get, and ultimately they're becoming attached to this world. And the whole, I'm going to be fascinated to see if they even make an attempt, like the proper relationship between humans and death, which marked Númenor for a long time, right? The submission to death. It's not like they instantly went bad, right? They had a proper relationship with death. They did. The Númenóreans did the death thing better than any other human culture that we know for the longest, right? I mean, they have a reputation for going very, very wrong with it in the end, right? But at the beginning, they had the most appropriate understanding of and appreciation of death and the end of the human lifespan. They're the only human society we're told is like reconciled to it in a sort of positive, in something like the way that seems like how humans are supposed to be, based within the way that Tolkien talks about the gift of Ilúvatar and all that kind of thing.
And you see that in the kings, and it's reflected in their leaders, because the kings gave up power before the end of their life. They didn't cling to power like later on. They gave up. They used the time to teach their followers, son or daughter, whoever it was, to teach them, right, to become a good ruler. But later on, they cling to their life. It's exactly what you said was reflected in how it went down the 25 rulers.
Exactly. And of course, we get the case study with Aragorn, right? In Appendix A, we see Aragorn doing the death thing right? Like the old Númenórean kings did, apparently. So we get this glimpse of what it can be. But again, it's all about, like, it's the tragedy, right? It's all about that decline. If we don't see Númenor not just powerful, right? It can't just be a strong country that collapses. It needs to be a good place, which becomes corrupted, right?
Yeah.
And not just, taken over by a demagogue who leads them in a bad direction and deceives them, right? We need to
Sauron
see
came in the last 50 years. He wasn't there the 3,000 whatever years before. He came in the last 50 years.
Exactly. So this then gets us towards the issue of compression, right? Because if this is if this kind of tragedy, give humans everything that they could want, but then they mess it up still from wanting more, and this difficulty that we've been talking about, that is in the books a very slow decline, right? From over the course of 1,500 years, something like that, from 2,000
I think the
to 2,000
shadow
years.
fall, I think it said the shadow fall around 1,500-ish. Yeah.
So we're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 1,500 years. Now, there are some significant problems with this when you're doing a screen adaptation of this kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
You can't, and I will say, even in our SilmFilm project, we ran into this last season. So we're in season 6 now. Season 5 of SilmFilm project was when we did the arrival of humans into Beleriand. So episode 1 of season 5 was Finrod and Beor.
Yeah.
And then we went through the Dagor Bragollach. And when we were discussing the framework of that season, we were having this problem all over the place. We were like, how can you tell a story over the course? Because we'd gotten used to a certain pace, right? With our all elvish cast, in season 3 and 4, 2, 3, and 4, really.
And then the humans came. And
exactly. Then the humans come and they keep being born and dying and being born and dying, and we're like, how can you tell a story which is passing through 4 generations over the course of one season? And the things that we did where we kind of we did some compression, right? We squeezed some things down so that we could basically have the kind of framing mechanism, character framing. I mean, we started with Beor, right? And then we brought in Endreth because we wanted to do the Athrobeth and get that element in there. So Endreth becomes the central human character in our season 5, right? And we introduced her fairly early on, but she's like the great grand, 2 or 3 generations down from Beor. But we skipped those quickly, right? We start with Beor, then we get Beor as an old man, so we show some time has passed, but we have the continuity of Beor, and then passing down from Beor ultimately to Endreth relatively quickly. And then we had Endreth growing to be a very old woman, and she's still alive, but very old by the time the Dagor Bragollach comes. So, but trying to find some consistency. You can't have in every single episode the characters that you got to know in the previous episode have all died of old age. You just can't have that. It's very, very hard to maintain that kind of story. And so how can you do any justice, even in the course of 5 seasons, to the fall of Númenor, when how... So,
and you can't just work with flashbacks. That's not.
It can't just be flashbacks.
That takes you out of the story. I've worked as a TV producer for one of Germany's biggest broadcasting stations, and we know what people want to see and what they don't like to see. They want to see a hero's journey, right? They want to see someone grow and fail and learn, and then have his redemption arc and whatnot, right? This is why we love Star Wars so much, right?
Right.
And except Rey. Don't like Rey, but anyway, because that's a bad storytelling. But anyway, let's not go there. But yes, that is exactly it, right? You can't tell that with 25 rulers and show that the audience would literally be, okay, I don't care anymore because this person is dead, and the only coherent is Galadriel and Elrond, and the 2, 3, 4, 5 elves. That doesn't make a good story.
Right. Yeah. And I was going to add, of course, there's then also the pressure on the other side. If you slow the time frame down so as to make it fit the humans, then it's weird for the elves, right?
Yes.
Then it's like, wait,
nothing.
right, what are they up to? Why do they, because you've got these like, and then, the elves decided to act quickly. So 500 years later, they called another council. Like that's kind of how the timelines tend to work there.
But do you know what I always feel with Tolkien? I think he very often exaggerates to make a point. And I do think you can shorten a lot of things down in Tolkien. Now, I'm a very impatient person. I don't mind the 25 kings, but I do think you can tell the decline of a civilization in, I don't know, 4 or 5 kings. Yes, I'm very, very sad we don't get all these crazy kings and queens, right? I'm sad about that, but I have them in the books. So, it doesn't make them redundant or not non-existent. But the thing is with Tolkien, he very often look at the Balrogs. Look at one of my favorite stories is The Fall of Gondolin. There were like 100 Balrogs before, and then there were maximum 5 or 7 in the whole legendarium. Right. So he very often changed these things. He often used, there were 100,000 of, the army was that strong. So he very often exaggerates to make a point. Mm-hmm. So I do think, for me, for show purpose, visual purpose, I'm okay with them saying, those are just a few years. It would be weird, and this is what I understood, that they make it really just a few years, because they can be 300-400 years old. So make it a few years, because what I want to see is the corruption of the ring bearers as well. This whole thing is called, I know we talk about Númenor, but this whole thing is about the rings, right? The rings of power, and Sauron corrupting these former good, powerful kings. Not all of them were black Númenorians before. They must have been good and wise leaders. I want to see that corruption, and that doesn't, I put the ring on your finger and now you're no.
And now you're evil, right?
Yeah, so that takes a bit of time, and the whole, plot with Farazon usurping the throne and Tar Palantir, as his wife's dad, one of the I want to see that. I want to see the whole, and they need to, for me, they need to show that. But I do think they can do that in, what is it, 6 seasons?
5 seasons.
5.
Yeah.
Still, they can do that.
Yeah. I don't know. Maggie, what are your thoughts about the compression thing, and what kind of pressures are on them for making that work?
I knew you were going to come to me for that. And I'm like, you guys haven't figured this out in years of talking about the Silmarillion. I don't have the answer in my back pocket, I'm afraid.
Oh, well.
But I
goes
think
that desperate hope.
No, I think the points both of you are making are absolutely valid, though. And I think the smart head on your shoulders about the story is what's most important. So, like, yeah, I don't want to make people angry. I don't want to change the timeline too much and take people out of what they know. But we don't know a lot, first of all, and you are able to compress these things. So, I mean, like you're saying, I was just lecturing about the hero's journey last night with Gabriel's course in King Arthur at Signum. So we were talking loads about this. You need to have the growth of that character for any kind of emotional attachment. You have to. You have to start from point A. You have to finish at point B. And there needs to be a growth in there. I feel the same about Rey, that she didn't have that opportunity. She was B to B. So if you don't have that, then we're at a loss. I think you can almost ignore the timeline in development and then bring the timeline back in. So I feel like you would probably just pick out the characters that you care the most about. Again, I don't know the plot here as well as you guys do. I'm just thinking, if I was dealing with something of this structure, I would deal with the people I want to deal with and how they relate to each other. And if King A doesn't actually relate to Elf A, then I just pretend that King D is King A. And exactly like you said, Helen, you would just compress that down. There's a bit in, actually, I think I did it in here, didn't I? That picture of Harry Potter where they're wandering in the woods. And I talked about, this 8-second clip is 80 pages of text. It's the same kind of thing. We don't need to see them wandering in the woods forever getting really frustrated. We just need to feel that frustration real fast and then move on. So if you can get someone to feel whatever that king's reign felt, and the actual factual historical things that get the plot to move on, great.
Right.
We can condense six kings into one. I know that's hearsay. I understand. I understand that's hard. But that's probably what I would do in terms of actual like story development.
Yeah,
Who
because
do I
it
need to
seems
have in there and how can I reassign that?
right. It seems to me that the essential thing, or to say the thing in a different way, here's what I think would be most bad, right? Like here's what I think would be the biggest failure, right? The biggest failure is to flatten out that sense of progress, right? That sense of decline. Helen, exactly as you were saying, both in the individual characters, like the ring bearers, like the future Nazgul, right? If you have like, hi, I am a good but sort of like dubiously inclined towards evil king, and now I get a ring, and now I am completely evil and under Sauron's sway. That's not interesting. I'm not going to care about that. That's not interesting. And it loses the opportunity to talk this drama that Tolkien was so good at depicting. The person who takes up this powerful thing for good reasons in order to accomplish a good end, and then ends up going down the path towards others, right? Like that's Saruman went all the way down the path. Boromir went the first few steps down, right? Before pivoting and turning back and then dying. Anyway, I like this.
Even Isildur, you can prove that.
Absolutely. So if you lose that sense of movement, right, in the character, this progression in the moral development or de-development, right, of the character, you're going to lose something significant, and that is played in big scale in the society of Númenor as a whole, right? If like the curtain rises and we get Númenor, the decadent empire, right, which is already like acting in a very dubious, like we're already like exploiting and enslaving the people of Middle Earth and everything. Maybe Sauron's not there yet, so maybe that's going to be a season 3 thing or whatever, right? When Sauron comes to Númenor. So we're not doing whole hog human sacrifice yet, but we already are like the late decadent Númenorian empire, and things are already bad. That's going to be the same as like depicting one of the Nazgul as like that already mostly evil king who's then going to take the ring and become a mindless evil, minion. That would be bad, right? So like that kind of flattening, if you just turn, if you kind of make true that classic brainless criticism of Tolkien that all of his characters are either completely black or completely white and there's no shades of gray in Tolkien, which is literally
Turin Turamba.
No, I mean like the whole thing, like there are very few books that depict with more care that progression, from one to the other. I still love the comment that which is of course delightful for its ironic the ironic faith that it puts in the reason of people. When the Two Towers came out, when he did his review of the Two Towers, and he's like, well, at least finally the Two Towers, which starts with the death of Boromir, the repentance and death of Boromir, is at least going to finally put to rest that stupid criticism that people are making, that all of Tolkien's characters are either black or white, because nobody could read the second book and still think that, right? And of course, like, it's charming, and I wish it were so. But anyway, the point is, they could essentially make that true of the show. Like it would be easy to make that true of the show by trying to compress it. Like because you don't give the time to have like, if you don't have 1,000 years or even 100 years to say, even 4 generations to say Númenor at its peak, right? Here's good Númenor, and now Númenor is going downhill, and here's why Númenor is going downhill, right? As we go, if they don't leave themselves any time at all to show that progress, then it's just going to be a kind of a cardboard. It's the evil empire which must be overthrown.
And that's all character development. I mean, when you think about it in terms of just like telling a story as well, if your story is boring for 25 minutes, everybody's going to turn their channel or pull out their phone. So if you're just going to have this flat line of pacing and everybody's now not paying attention, you're going to lose everybody. So like every single episode has to have this arc as well. So every character has to have this arc, but every episode has to have this arc. So if you need to have that kind of pacing, you're going to have to tighten things up. You're going to have to play around with things because people are falling asleep. You need some drama. Go, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
And what Corey said, what I really want to see is what Corey said in the beginning, you know, I don't want them to portray this and them failing, falling and drowning in the end, just because of Sauron, because that was just the tip of the iceberg, right? That was not the real reason. And I want them to show that, because otherwise somebody like Aragorn wouldn't make sense. A character like Aragorn who learned and, you know, who was ashamed of, we talked about this earlier, about his ancestry, blah, blah. And that was not, he wasn't ashamed because Sauron was responsible for the downfall of his civilization. Then they wouldn't have, you know, that's not the reason. He was ashamed of his ancestry,
the sense
because
of people learning the
they,
lesson from Númenor, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I want that to be shown, right? The failing of mankind, not just because of Sauron. That can be Black Númenorians or whatever. He's, you know, influencing them and whatever. I want the Númenorians to F it up themselves, mainly.
Right.
No, but that is important.
No, I hear that.
And
I hear that.
That's the essence of Tolkien. Yeah.
And to make sure that we don't lose. Now, I agree. I don't think you need all 1,000 years. Like, the fact that they're compressing, it doesn't mean that the kind of flat, static stories that we're talking about are inevitable with this kind of compression. You can do it. But it's going to be challenging. And what they're like, the challenge that is before them, I think, is going to. So let's assume the most extreme example, which I'm afraid all of the evidence that we have, which is not very much yet, but all of the small amount of evidence that we have suggests that this is the case, that they're going to do one generation. Like, we're going to get Isildur from, you know, the beginning of season 1. I mean, at least that he exists. Maybe he's young. Maybe we will get some growth. But anyway, the whole show looks like it might happen over the course of a fairly small number of years, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about, like, what would it look like to do that well? And the first thing that I think you'd have to do, and you'd have to accomplish, would be to establish, okay, you're not going to get a chance to show Númenor, you know, at the peak, right? You're not going to get, you know, we're not going to really see and invest in, we're not going to whole episodes, right, of like the good kings of Númenor and the good kingdom, you know, like I would have loved it if we could have started with Aldarion, right? Maybe. And begin at like, you know, which is not only a good time in Númenor, but also
he was a bad husband, and he
was a bad
wife.
Husband. I absolutely agree with that. But anyway, the point is, like, there's the good, but we also show the beginning of the decline, right, as evidenced by his issues with his wife. So I would have loved to go from, you know, I'd have compressed it, but anyway, whatever. We're not doing. So if we're not doing that, you still have to establish, like, if they fail to establish clearly in the minds of the viewers what Númenor was, like, if you look around at the decadent empire of Númenor and the king's men walking around and our Pharazôn on the throne already, and if you don't look around and say, oh, this is such a shame, what loss has already happened, like Númenor's almost dead already. Like, the, you know, the good Númenor, the Númenor that was, has already perished. That sense of loss needs to be there. And so if you're not going to show any of it, like if you're not going to do all that earlier stuff with Númenor way up here, and you're just going to start down here at near the tail end of the corruption, how do you establish that higher old
with the two
vision?
With the two houses? I do think they want to establish that with the two houses by portraying the house of Silmarillion, the faithful, as the good ones, and I do think they will sit together around the fireplace and tell the story of their ancestors. I love Game of Thrones, right? I'm not a big fan of the books, read them, but I love the show. Well, the beginning of the show. And you often have flashback, and you often have somebody telling a story of, you know, the ancestors of the Targaryens and all that. And they do it in such a good way. And that also, you know, they have the different houses that portray different stages of men, right? You have, you know, the Northerners who still pray to the old gods, but this is the same timeline. This is all in a few years. The the whole fight thing is, I don't know, it's like 7 years, say 5, 6, the girls grew up, but it's not a lot, right? It's just a short time span. And they show it with the differences of the houses, where they are, what they believe in. And I do think you can portray that in the two lines, in the line of Silmarillion and in, you know, the debauchery and whatnot taking place in the king's halls with Farazon.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe.
If I could make one like desperate compromise with the one generation version of the Númenor story, it would be to reintroduce Tar Palantir, as you were saying before. Like I would, if they could start, if they could start with Tar Palantir with like the attempt to revive Númenor as was, which would be a great way to show Númenor as was, right? Yeah. And then show the usurpation by Ar-Pharazôn upon his death, right? And the that would be.
And you can show his last days. You don't need to. Yes.
Yeah. You don't have to do his whole story.
Show his last. No, right. Exactly. Show his last days, and he can make, you know. But when you and I talked about the queens, we also talked about him because he's creepy AF. And you know, him making that prophecy about the line of kings failing, which basically also inclines, you know, Númenor failing, and he can make that prophecy basically on his deathbed or wherever, and then this sets up, you know, the whole plot. Then that would be awesome.
Yeah, I would love to start with Tar Palantir. As you say, start with Tar Palantir. Well, maybe not on his deathbed, but start with old Tar Palantir and the, you know, get the succession, the very horrible usurpation succession. Let that happen in like the second episode or something like that. You know, would be totally fine. Like I'd be totally fine with that. And it would establish some movement and give us that framework. Tar Palantir then becomes like the spokesperson for Númenor as was, right? And then we see the fall, right? We see for the fall from and the contrast between the court of Númenor under Tar Palantir and then the court of Númenor under Ar-Pharazôn, right? Like so that would give us that sense of movement, that sense of tragedy. Again, I feel like if we're not looking around, if we have no memories, like if the viewers have no memory of how Númenor was, like how Númenor
you don't care about
should
the
have
downfall.
been, we're just going to look around and be like, okay, it's another like ye old decadent empire, right? We've seen this lots of times depicted in lots of stories, and you lose that sense of tragedy. So that's, but there are ways that you can do that. I agree. Having the two factions, with the faithful and the Kingsmen, which is baked right into the story there, right? That's really handed to them. And that can enable, if we have the contrast between like Elendil and Amandil's, I don't know if they're going to cut Amandil. They probably are. But anyway, like between Elendil's house and
still sailing, who knows where he is?
Right, exactly. They could have it like he's already gone, right, or whatever. And this is a hard thing. Like it is a really hard thing for book fans. It's another thing that I found, by the way, in SilmFilm. We cut a bunch of characters in the last season because there's just too many humans kicking around. Like Tolkien was thinking in terms of genealogies in a lot of places, not in terms of like stories, like the kind of story that he was doing in Lord of the Rings. And so when we're trying to develop these stories and develop these characters, we're like, no, he gave like that thing to that one character and this thing to this other character, and that was the only thing they had. Like they had these one couple incidents, which when you're doing genealogies, when you're doing like the tale of years, that works perfectly fine, right? But when you're trying to develop characters in a show, we're like, we need as much as we can get. So we kept shoving together characters and combining them and removing excess family siblings and
so you have to do that with something like this. There's just too many that so often you just pick your through line or your lens, right? Like everything has to follow that. So if it doesn't come into line with the lens or your through line, then they're on the cutting room block. They're up for the snuff.
But then again, I just want to mention Game of Thrones, and it worked there. There were so many houses, so many kings, and you cared for, you even cared for the gardener. What was her name? the gardeners were the ones that died out, you know, the rich people, whatever, that blew up in the sept. You even cared about their families, right? But they were just minor, you know, one of the seven. And that is so cool. He did that. But you're right in a way, because we also have dwarves to cover, we have elves.
Yeah.
So
But you could think of them as the same as the houses, right? Like we're talking about different races, but they could absolutely be the same as the houses. As long as there's an arc, as long as there's a motive connection, and as long as they're all following the same through line, which could be a timeline, which could be a person, which could be an energy, you know, whatever the hell they decide to choose as their through line. I could care about all those people at the same time. It's magic.
Yeah, I do. I feel the same. I did in a visual thing like Game of Thrones. Can't really think of another. But yeah, no, as many characters. No, I don't. I've recently rewatched Vikings and Vikings Valhalla, but you don't have that many fractions even there.
Right.
No, it's true.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's where I found again when we were talking about making choices in SilmFilm, where I found myself wanting to combine characters was when there were like two very similar jobs being done by two different characters, and it made the more story, right, to be able to combine them into one place. So I would suspect that Amandil, Elendil's dad, is not going to be there. That they'll give that role to Elendil himself, because they're very similar, right? I mean, that the position that they have is very similar. And I'm not saying that Amandil's a bad character. People always think whenever I'm arguing to compress in SilmFilm, people react like I hate that character and I think Tolkien was wrong to create it. Like, no, it works. Like there is a role within the context of the story, but
he picked up the torch of his father and fulfilled.
Exactly. And to have it would make Elendil's character, it would make our connection to Elendil's character stronger and quicker if he were the one who was the advisor to the king, and you know, instead of his dad, basically. Because it puts, I mean, in the if you rigorously did the story as it's depicted in the book, Elendil himself does nothing until he arrives in Middle-earth. I mean, he doesn't actually accomplish a single thing himself. It's his dad and his son. Isildur does, right? He steals the fruit of the tree. But Elendil himself doesn't actually do anything. Who is he? What is he? So if we're supposed to, if you're going to try to get us to connect with him as a character, putting him in that kind of patriarchal role of the leader of the faithful, and of course the way that sets him up for the Last Alliance and everything, it works really, really well. I'll be pretty surprised if they don't cut Amandil at the end of the day. But
and him and Ar-Pharazôn, you know, being former friends, and then, you know, which they were, and then, you know, them setting up for two fractions. I'm interested in, do you guys think that Miriel, right, so his wife, because we don't know a lot about like lore-wise from Tolkien himself about was she very unwilling, was she, because what we know in the end, and this is, I want to see that scene please, when she literally clings to life climbing the Menel Tarma when Númenor is drowning, right? And so I want to see, is she willing? Is she at the, because her father is said to have been, you know, the last good, or he tried. So Palante was her father. So, but was she, because obviously it's Ig, because it's her cousin, Ar-Pharazôn is her cousin. So I don't think she will be like, yeah, you know, marry me, please. But then I would be, there are
different levels of complicity she could have.
Yes, exactly. And I would be interested in how they portray, because they can't really go against canon because we don't know. Tolkien doesn't really say what she felt, what she did. Did she rule with him? Did that, you know, was he just, we don't know about that. So that would be interesting. Is she good? Is she bad? For me, always the symbol of her, you know, like, I thought she was bad in the end.
Moment.
But I thought in the end she was with her husband and she believed everything Sauron said, because we know the queens of Númenor, not so, you know.
Sketchy lot.
Yes, exactly. So I want that, and I love these evil female characters or becoming evil. I would be down for Miriel, you know,
having
not
her
being so good.
That's great.
having her be, I mean, because of course, potentially she could be a really interesting character in that you have Elendil and Ar-Pharazôn as the two kind of poles, right? The two faction leaders, and representatives and spokespeople of the two different perspectives, right? She provides the clearest opportunity to be the one who's in the middle, right? The one who sees both sides, the one who can talk to both of them and does talk to both of them and sympathize with each of them to a different extent, right?
Yeah.
I would be tempted
Which her
to
dad probably did.
Yeah.
Which her dad probably did, because Ar-Pharazôn, Gimli-Khad was his. So Ar-Pharazôn's father was his brother. So he must have had a close and he died. So he must have had a close relationship with Ar-Pharazôn. Maybe he was something like his stepson or something like that, right? To Tar-Palantir. That would be interesting.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, and the more creepy when he then marries Miriel, but because then it's like not only first cousin slash stepsister situation.
Just saying Sassy and Jamie, you know.
Well, there you go.
Things happen.
There you go. These things happen.
Or Cleopatra and all the Egyptian rulers. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That dynasty.
But again, it does to have Muriel be that kind of a I mean, I would be kind of tempted if I were writing the story. I would be tempted to make her like this, like if Ar-Pharazôn is the spokesperson for the like bad impulse, right, in Númenor. He is the person out of whose mouth comes all of the statements of corrupt Númenor, right?
Yeah.
And Elendil is the other side, right? Elendil is the one who is the representative of these good impulses, and so we can depict those two things. I would be tempted to depict Muriel as like the representative of the hearts and minds of the people of Númenor, basically, right? And so I would also have her go over to Ar-Pharazôn's side, and when she does, like she would like have a break with Elendil eventually, right? And she'd choose sides and she'd choose Ar-Pharazôn. And when that happens, that would be like the moment of no return. Like now the island's going to sink, like for sure. And so, I mean, it'd be how I'd be. Now, again, I wouldn't make her complicit from the beginning.
No.
You know, she would be a victim. I wouldn't want to lose the victim, but I think that Muriel's story is much more interesting if she's more than just a victim.
Yeah. Yes, please. That's what I want to see.
Yeah. And then like and then it makes her final scene, right? Her attempt to climb the Menel Tarma, like the attempt to repent of her choices too late. Right. And then she's, you know, like it's like the time for repentance, the time for changing was before. You didn't then, and it's too late now. And so, but she's desperately trying to climb the Menel Tarma and the wave overtakes her. I mean, that's awesome. It's so powerful. Yeah.
And that mountain is so symbolic, right? And she should have been the rightful queen because only the, rulers actually were supposed to go there. So very symbolic. Yeah, I'm interested in that portrayal especially.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that they're gonna get. I mean, I can't imagine that the Amazon team is gonna look at Tar-Muriel and be like, nah, whatever. That sounds Deadwood. Let's cut that, right? I mean, there's so many obviously, at least potentially, compelling things about her character. I really. Hope they take good advantage of that, because especially if they're gonna try to pack all of the drama into one generation, I think she'd be a really important element of that. So, awesome. Well, we should let you go, Helen. Thank you for joining us. This has been such a fun discussion.
Yay!
I love just basking in the two of you talking to each other. That was fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so thank you so much, Helen. We'll have you on again later on, hopefully maybe after we get more stuff from Amazon and see, more to talk about. But but this has been a lot of fun. I've been looking forward to talking. I've been wanting to do the Númenor discussion and think through Númenor, especially the compression issue. And you're the perfect person to have this conversation. We've had wonderful Númenor conversations before, so I was immediately thinking of you. So glad you could join us.
Thank you so much, guys, and enjoy the rest. I'll follow that on my computer. And yeah, for everybody who wants to know more, I have
Yes.
a very long Numenor and elves. I just love elves, so my channel is mainly about first and second age elves stuff and Numenor. Yeah, so follow me on the Clueless Fangirl on YouTube and on Twitter. I tweet weird things sometimes.
Very good. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And I know
Cool.
we put your YouTube
Yeah,
channel in the chat here, a link to that, so people will be able
perfect.
to find you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye
Thanks,
Thank you.
bye.
Helen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Take care.
Okay, so one last topic we wanted to follow up on is I wanted to talk a little bit because it's a bit of a follow up on my critfic discussion from last week. That is, I want to talk about another example of how that's often gets applied in a way that I have found extremely pervasive here. So let me start this off by asking a trick question. Who's making the Rings of Power series? Because the answer to that, what everybody says, right, is Amazon.
Right.
But that's not true. The corporate giant is not producing this TV series. They're funding it. Yes.
Distributing it.
What?
They're distributing it.
They're
They're taking
distributing
care of the
it.
nuts and bolts. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. But like I've heard people not only just kind of using this as a kind of heuristic, right? Like, yeah, it's coming out of Amazon Studios. Okay. Yeah, sure. It is, right? All TV shows and films come out of some studio or other, and this is the one that is coming out of. Okay. But I've heard people go further and talk as if what we're seeing in this show, like, it's inappropriate to look at this show as some kind of work of art, right? This is a corporate production, right? This is just something that's being put out there by a corporation and is therefore not artistic. It's soulless, and it's I listen to this and I'm like, what is it? Are they supposed to have grown this in a petri dish somewhere? Like, how?
And you
That's
still haven't
not
even
how
watched
these
it.
things work.
And they haven't watched it yet. So like I still come back to that point of like,
Yeah.
I mean, we could have a very long conversation about media conglomerate, huge studios versus indies, which maybe that we do that in another
Yeah.
episode of just kind of like how these things are structured and how it comes to be. But yeah, at the end of the day, like it's individual people making a piece of art. So how can we pass such a massive judgment of Amazon's making it? I hate it. You can hate
Right.
Amazon as a company.
Yes.
That's fine. There's a lot of dodgy things going on. But, when it comes down to what they're creating and the stories, until we see it, we can't really say much about that.
Yeah, and it's just so there are going to be human beings who will have written the script and produce, like, there are people working on it. So I it's starting to, like, I'm trying to get myself out of the habit of saying, what's Amazon going to do in this show? Answer, nothing. No, but like the question is like, what are the showrunners and the writers, and the directors going to be doing in this show? Like, that's the actual question. Now, you can ask, like, how did they find these people? Like, how are these people hired? But again, when you're talking about these big corporations, and later on, we won't go too far onto this today. We'll come back to this question because I would love to learn more about the kinds of things that you do see, because I feel like there's a lot that I don't know about this. The one thing I do feel fairly confident in saying is, although it's true that obviously there are some expectations that come down the pipe from, the owners of the studio, right? Amazon does have presumably some goals for what they're wanting to achieve by, the $1 billion that they're paying. They want some return on that money, I think, from this show. And so they have some goal. The corporate conglomerate has some goals. And therefore, there will be some, strictures, guidelines, limitations, that may be imposed upon the
Contractually
production.
imposed.
Yeah, based on that. But of course, like the idea that strictures being imposed upon a production are nothing new and not unique to this kind of a corporate environment.
And not necessarily limiting either. It like you said, because they're so expected, it's not really something that's going to crump my style. Like
Right.
I'll still be able to be the creative mastermind. And if I am Amazon and I am investing this amount of money and expecting some sort of a return, it's in my best interest to have people who are super creative and passionate and can
Yes.
think outside the box and be aware of all the minutia and all these little bits and pieces that people are going to latch onto and emote. Because me as a media conglomerate have no emotions, I better hire somebody that has emotions.
Right.
So,
Right. And
yeah.
they're also, not that they never do anything dumb, but they're not, they didn't get where they are by being completely stupid and oblivious. And so if they, presumably they want something, they want some return on their investment in this show, and presumably they know they're not going to get it if it's horrible, and so therefore are motivated by to anyway, whatever. Like it's what I get frustrated by is, again, sort of the sloppiness. And again, it comes back to the critfic thing, right? Like when you say this show is going to be horrible because it's put out by Amazon. Amazon is this massive corporation. It's like the really sloppy critfic narrative about Star Wars, right? Disney is ruining Star Wars. It's like, okay, look, there's lots of things, you can build, if you want to build an argument that says the things that are produced in the Marvel world or the Star Wars world, since either of those franchises were taken over by Disney, if you want to make an argument that says the Marvel stuff and the Disney stuff, and the Star Wars stuff that has been produced under the purview of Disney is inferior to what was done before, and show me how that is, and then and then ideally explain some of the cause and effect, what it is that Disney's doing that has made that worse. Okay, but nobody actually makes that argument. People just wave their hands at it and be like, "Oh, Disney has wrecked Star Wars," and I'm just, as somebody is especially in. In my case, as a very casual Star Wars fan, I'm looking, I'm like, well, I haven't loved everything that they've done for sure. But I think The Mandalorian's fantastic and one of the greatest things the Star Wars franchise has ever produced. So I have a hard time watching The Mandalorian, which I think is excellent, and just listening to people be like, oh, Disney's wrecked Star Wars. And I'm like, okay, that is at the very least a massively sloppy generalization, right? But worst, you're not saying anything yet. Like you're and again, it's that the classic critfic problem, right? Where it sounds like because there's an implied cause and effect, right? And since you're stating a cause and effect, then therefore you've said something, right? But you've not actually said anything about the shows themselves.
And this isn't us supporting one or the other. It's purely, I'm not saying Amazon's perfect and, they're obviously not funding us or anything like that. It's more like I'm not going to make a snap judgment until I have something to judge.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that's where we are. I mean, I sure hope they've hired people that know the inner workings of this world and are building something beautiful and perfect, like lovely. But that might not happen. It might be crap, but I'm not going to pass any judgment until I know.
Right, exactly. It is harder. And actually, one thing, Edith, I agree that one of my kind of corollaries to this concern is exactly what you're saying, that people act like big evil corporations function as independent entities, right? Like they just like that. Yeah. And actually, this is one of the things that I know that lots of people are, disapprove of what Amazon as a corporation or Disney as a corporation does and some of their practices or whatever. But actually, the more you complain about Amazon or Disney, the more you are letting off the human beings who made the choices that led to those things. Like, the corporation doesn't do anything. The corporation doesn't exist. People exist. I mean, and this is like, I look, I have founded a corporation myself, Signum University is a nonprofit corporation, but we're still technically a corporation. But like, we can say Signum does this or Signum does that or Signum believes in this or that. But I, as founder and president of Signum, am painfully aware that Signum doesn't exist on its own. It doesn't do anything. It's just the people who, you know, I might do some things and I've made some decisions, and other people do some things and say some things and make some decisions, and we together do some things and agree upon things. But the institution doesn't have an independent life of its own. And so the more you say, oh, these big corporations are evil, big corporations aren't evil. Evil acts are done by people who run and make decisions in big corporations. And the more you just chalk it up to the corporation, the more you're letting those people escape criticism, which they shouldn't escape criticism. Anyway, it's this is, again, it's a corollary to this thing. But I think, honestly, like that kind of thinking, the kind of sloppy generalization that just groups, because I mean, there are, and not to mention, there are like, how many employees does Amazon have? How many manager level employees? Like, how many decision makers are involved in Amazon? Not just in this production, not just in this wing, but in Amazon as a whole, right? And even to say Amazon is evil, well, has Amazon, you know, have some people at Amazon done some evil things? Yeah, but they've also done some good. Other people have done good things as well. It's just, it's a sloppiness of thinking I think is really dangerous on lots and lots of levels. But as far as its application to this, I absolutely cannot get into. And Maggie, as you say, you keep very sensibly bringing it back to one very simple principle, right? And that is, if you're prejudging, if you're saying that we have reason to know it's going to be horrible before you've ever seen it, you're just not, like, you're not making a responsible, rational decision as a human being.
You're also really ruining it for yourself. You have no opportunity to even try to like it. Like, I stopped reading reviews of films years ago until I've seen the film, because I'm just so sick of having other people's opinions in my head before I go in and enjoy something myself. And I'm more likely to enjoy it if I just go and watch it without any preconception. So I'd much rather give myself that opportunity, and 4 minutes in, I have the right to say, nope, this is crap, but I have the right to do that.
No, exactly. And there's a certain responsibility that we have to do that. Again, if you want to abdicate your right, you know, to draw your own judgment, then you can do that.
Go for it.
But it certainly is a silly thing to do, to you know, try to convince others not to do that.
And there are some real.
Go ahead.
There are some real perks about this too that I'm sure we can get into, of just like, you know, I think about some of my favorite texts that have been adapted before and how poorly they were done because the time frame was too condensed. I don't mean the story. I mean, they had to shoot in 6 weeks instead of 20 or whatever.
Right.
And the budget was 20 million when it really should have been around 80 to 90. And, you know, all these things that really ended up limiting the opportunities for the text that I would have loved to see more care taken, and then it brought to screen a little bit more carefully. This is being brought to screen very carefully. We don't know if it's going to be good yet, but we can be pretty certain that there's a lot of attention, money, care, thought going into it. They're not just pulling it out of the vault because they've owned the rights for 10 years and want to make a quick buck, you know?
Right. Exactly. And again, the whole, I mean, this goes back to the Peter Jackson films, when people were, the Hobbit films, when people kept being like, oh, this is just a money grab. It's just a money grab. And it's like, well, everybody's trying to make money. Right?
They'll probably make money. Yeah.
They'll probably make money. Every studio, like, that's insane that you're not yet saying anything, right? Of course they want to make money. Everybody wants to make money. They're not a business if they don't want to make money, but you know, there are some other factors there, and we can, if we want, draw conclusions about their motivations again after the fact. But the mere fact that perhaps somebody involved, again, I feel the same way with the Disney stuff. Like when people talk about like what Disney has done to these things, and they're afraid that Amazon is going to do to the Lord of the Rings what Disney has done to Star Wars. What I keep hearing is, oh, they're just going to keep trotting out like spin-off after spin-off, and like actually, you know, just to kind of milk it.
And
I know, and I'm like, that sounds awesome. Like, yeah, absolutely. There are so many good stories that can be done, and I think they're oh man, it could be fantastic, right? That could be absolutely fantastic. And there's a large, do I love all of the, Phase 4 Marvel series that have been released by Disney? No, but I like several of them very much.
And I really enjoyed all of them for what they were, because I got to spend more time in that world. And then I didn't have to revisit it. I was done with that one,
Right, exactly.
Like, I like Indiana, but I don't need to go back to it. You can experience part of a world because it's all world building, but you get to choose what you get to dip into and spend more time with.
Right.
But that's how I felt about The Hobbit. I was just glad. Yeah, I was just glad to spend more time in Middle Earth. But yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to spend that much time with The Hobbit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I don't think, now again, like, if you begin to get a trend of, a whole bunch of really bad shows that are being poorly resourced and poorly staffed, and, then okay, like, now you've got a complaint, right? Yeah. But the complaint is not that they're doing more things. The complaint is that they're doing them badly, right?
Yeah.
And that's a totally different thing. And it needs to be based on, first and foremost, watching the thing and judging it for what it is, rather than prejudging it, or, again, making a statement about the circumstances and thinking that you've made a statement about the thing. Again, that's the fundamental crit-fic slide that I think is just always introduces a kind of dishonesty, sometimes unintentional, sometimes unaware. I think people are often genuinely unaware that they've made that slip into crit-fic, because it's such a pervasive way of thinking. But anyway, anyway, so it's a specific application. I had this on my list to talk about last week. We didn't get to it last week. Yeah. I would love to learn more about the differences between big studios and indie studios, and what exactly that means, and the advantages and disadvantages of both, and
totally. Well, me too. Yeah. I mean, like, I can definitely do a bit in an upcoming one, but like, everything is so down to individual productions too,
right?
And who's in charge of that, and who's holding the purse strings, and which studio representative is on set making sure the rules are being followed, because some of them are not as flexible as others, and
right.
So there's so many different factors that go into it. But we can certainly talk a bit about like the pros and cons of indie versus, major conglomerate and stuff, because that is really interesting, especially when you're talking about developing a known work and the decisions that have to be made.
Right. Absolutely.
There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Oops, sorry, I lost you there. That last.
Oh, sorry. I said there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Yeah, sorry, my internet is crazy.
And as you said a couple of weeks ago, that's always true. Right. There are always lots of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to any kind of screen production. And this is, again, another thing that even if you think about to think of another, it's impossible to talk about things as a fan, I think, without using this kind of heuristic. Right. We tend to say things like Amazon is producing the show. We also tend to say things like the Peter Jackson films. Right, as if Peter Jackson was the sole artist behind those movies, right? Not acknowledging, and I've tried. I've actively been trying, as when I've been referring to those films, to change my own vocabulary there, and I've started trying to refer to them as the films made by the Peter Jackson team, just to kind of vaguely acknowledge, like, I know there are other people, it's not just him.
Dispersion of responsibility.
Yeah, just dispersion of responsibility. But yeah, because then especially, like, think of the number of conversations that people have had where they've been like, Tolkien versus Peter Jackson, right? And it's like, you're not comparing apples to apples there at all.
No. Yeah, I think I even said that in one of these sessions where, like, yeah, you've got the author who's one person who wrote a book with maybe an editor and a beta reader, but then you have film. And like, the example I always use is the first day I was on Twilight, and there were 11 people in charge of moving bushes around to cover up street signs so you couldn't tell we were in Oregon. Like, 11 people for a bush. That's a bush.
Right.
So then when you think about something like every decision in film is so purposeful, if you're talking about the guy carrying the antlers, that bugged you so much in the trailer. Do you know how many people probably made the decision about that? First,
Right.
should they carry antlers? What should they look like? How are they being harnessed? How are they being attached to their bodies? Why are they,
And then
there's
the people who
so
actually
much
made the
thought.
antlers to as part of the
Yeah.
prop makers, and
Yeah. That although it may take us out of the moment and be like, what are they doing? I'm sure there's a reason.
Right. Right. No, I'm
Yeah, we'll see.
I'm
Might
not
not be a good
blindly
one. It
hostile
might
to the
it might still
antlers.
be lame, but
It might still be lame. Yeah, yeah.
I bet they thought about it.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
I'm sure they did. Yeah, awesome. Okay, well we will come back and discuss some more of these things later, moving forward. But thanks everybody for joining us today. Thanks Maggie for your time. This was a
For
fun...
watching quietly and cheering you both on. It was fantastic. I like this like alternating week thing. Every couple of weeks, I'll just sit here going, "Great, I'm gonna learn more." I feel like I should minimize my little window. I feel like we should say if people want to submit questions and topics,
Yeah,
like I welcome
absolutely.
that. If there's, because
Absolutely.
I kind of make assumptions too. I've noticed this in my classes. I make assumptions that folks at least have a baseline of whatever we're talking about, and that's not necessarily true. So,
Yeah,
do let us
if
know if
there are
there's
things
something
we're
you'd like to
taking
talk
for
about.
granted that you'd like us to back up and talk about,
Yeah.
if there are other questions or issues or concerns that you have as you're thinking about this, if there are other adaptations that you want to talk about, which I think we can learn from and sort of think about more. Of course, like we're thinking about the Rings of Power series as it's coming out, but we're not unwilling to talk about other things. And of course, I'm
This is
also
step one.
I'm also kind of interested to talk about the War of the Rohirrim film that's supposed to be coming out in 2024, the anime film. So there's going to be some really interesting questions about that. We'll talk about that later, but there's certainly some questions about that too. Anyway, so do feel free.
This is a fluid show.
It is a fluid show. So where you can submit that for now, we'll get it. I keep forgetting to make a designated email for this. We'll do that.
Well, why don't I'll do a thing on Mythgard.
Okay.
We'll do a little submission form box or something.
Great. Yeah, we'll do a submission form box there, and then you can have a play. In the meantime, you can always send emails to info@signumu.org and they'll get to me and we'll figure it out. But we'll make a submission form in the meantime. So awesome.
Perfect.
Thanks everybody, and we will see you guys next week. Bye now.
Bye.